The promises people remember most are usually the ones everyone else believed would be broken. The late afternoon sun stretched across the rolling pastures of central Texas as 17-year-old Emily Carter hurried toward the weathered ranch house with dust clinging to her worn boots. She had grown up around horses, fences, and long days beneath the open sky, but nothing had prepared her for the silence waiting behind the old wooden door. Samuel Walker, a 72-year-old cowboy whose entire life had been devoted to forgotten horses, rested quietly in a small bedroom overlooking the pasture he had loved for decades. His breathing had become slow, yet his eyes remained fixed on the window where one elderly brown quarter horse stood alone beneath a sprawling oak tree. The horse's name was Chief, and even from a distance he refused to leave his place beside the fence, as though he somehow understood that time was running out. Emily stepped closer and gently took Samuel's weathered hand. He smiled faintly before looking toward the pasture again. His voice was weak but steady as he quietly admitted that he had never been afraid of leaving this world. The only thing that still weighed on his heart was the future of the 11 forgotten horses that depended on him. Years earlier, neighbors had admired the ranch, but as Samuel grew older and illness slowly stole his strength, fewer people came to visit. Feed deliveries became harder to manage, fences aged beneath the Texas sun, and the horses gradually disappeared from everyone's thoughts except his own. They were never mistreated, but they had been quietly forgotten by a world that moved too quickly to notice an old cowboy struggling to care for them alone. Samuel looked back at Emily with tired eyes filled not with fear but with hope. He asked her to promise that no matter what happened after he was gone, she would never allow the horses to be scattered or abandoned. Emily felt the weight of those words settle deep inside her heart. She had no money, no experience running an entire ranch, and no idea how she could possibly keep such a promise alive. Even so, she squeezed Samuel's hand and softly answered that she would save every one of his horses. A peaceful smile slowly crossed the old cowboy's face. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though the burden he had carried for years had finally become lighter. Outside the window, Chief lifted his head toward the house without making a sound. Emily followed the horse with her eyes and quietly wondered whether animals could somehow feel promises the same way people did. As evening settled across the ranch, relatives and neighbors arrived after hearing that Samuel's condition had worsened. When Emily repeated the promise she had made, several people exchanged uncertain glances. One man gently remarked that keeping 11 forgotten horses alive required far more than good intentions. Another quietly suggested that selling the animals would be the most practical solution once Samuel was gone. Nobody spoke with cruelty. They simply believed reality would eventually overcome the determination of one ranch girl. Emily listened without arguing because she knew they were measuring the promise with numbers while she was measuring it with loyalty. Before leaving the room, she looked once more through the window. Chief remained standing beneath the old oak tree, watching the house with calm, unwavering patience. In that silent moment, Emily realized her promise had already begun, even though almost everyone around her believed it was destined to fail. 3 days after Samuel Walker passed away, the small country church grew quiet as the last visitors slowly drove away beneath a pale Texas sky. Emily Carter remained standing near the weathered wooden fence that overlooked the ranch instead of joining the others for lunch in town. She could still hear Samuel's final request echoing in her thoughts, and every passing minute made that promise feel heavier than before. Beyond the fence, the 11 horses wandered silently across the pasture. They had enough hay for the moment, clean water still filled the old troughs, and the land remained peaceful, yet something about the ranch felt different. The familiar rhythm they had known for years had disappeared. Chief stood farther away than the others, watching every movement Emily made. With calm but cautious eyes. He did not approach the fence, nor did he lead the herd away. He simply observed, as though waiting to discover whether another human would soon disappear from their lives. Emily unlocked the old ranch gate using the worn brass key Samuel had trusted her with. The hinges creaked softly as she stepped inside carrying only a bucket of fresh apples and a folded lawn chair. She remembered everything she had learned while helping around neighboring ranches. Horses that had lost trust could not be rushed. They needed consistency far more than confidence. Instead of walking toward the herd, she placed the apples beneath the old oak tree, unfolded the chair nearly 50 feet away, and quietly sat down without expecting anything in return. The horses noticed her immediately. Several lifted their heads before drifting together behind Chief, who slowly positioned himself between Emily and the rest of the herd. His posture was calm but protective, reflecting years of responsibility rather than fear. Emily smiled gently and looked toward the distant hills instead of staring directly at the horses. Minutes became an hour, and the only sounds were birds singing above the pasture and the soft wind moving through dry grass. Before leaving that afternoon, Emily gathered the untouched apples and quietly returned home without taking a single step closer to the horses. The following morning she came back at nearly the same hour. This time she carried a different book from the county library along with fresh hay and clean water buckets. She repaired a loose fence board, swept the barn aisle, and checked every gate before returning to the same chair beneath the oak tree. Once again, Chief watched every movement. Once again, the herd kept its distance. Emily never tried calling them. She simply opened her book and began reading softly to herself. The words were not meant for the horses. They were simply part of the peaceful routine she hoped would make the ranch feel familiar again. As the days passed, several neighbors stopped by. Most wished her well, but nearly everyone quietly questioned whether she should continue. They explained that maintaining 11 horses required money, experience, and help that one 17-year-old ranch girl simply did not have. One older rancher kindly suggested finding buyers while the horses were still healthy. Emily thanked him for caring but politely refused. She had not promised to try. She had promised to protect them. Late one cool evening, as the golden sunlight faded behind the pasture, Emily quietly closed her book and stood to leave. At that exact moment, Chief took a single slow step away from the herd and moved only a few feet closer to the old oak tree before stopping again. It was not enough for anyone else to notice, but Emily saw it clearly. She smiled without speaking because she understood that trust was not measured in miles. Sometimes it began with only one careful step. The next week settled into a quiet routine that seemed almost invisible to everyone except Emily Carter and the 11 horses watching her from a distance. Every morning just after sunrise she unlocked the ranch gate, filled the water troughs, checked every section of fencing, swept the old barn, and left fresh hay beneath the shelter before carrying her folding chair beneath the familiar oak tree. She never carried a rope, never reached for a halter, and never attempted to shorten the distance between herself and the herd. She had begun to understand that trust could never be demanded. It had to be freely given. Chief remained the first to notice her arrival every day. The elderly brown quarter horse would quietly raise his head before the others, listening to the sound of her boots crossing the dry ground. The remaining horses naturally gathered behind him, following every decision he made without hesitation. Emily realized that Samuel had not only cared for 11 horses. He had protected a family that depended on one quiet leader to keep everyone safe. If Chief decided she belonged, the others would eventually believe it too. One cool morning Emily discovered an old wooden tack room she had not explored before. Dust covered nearly every shelf, but inside an aging cabinet she found several neatly stacked journals tied together with faded leather straps. They belonged to Samuel. During her lunch break she carried one outside and sat beneath the oak tree while the horses grazed in the distance. The journal was filled with simple daily notes rather than dramatic stories. Samuel had written about every horse by name, describing favorite grazing spots, different personalities, old habits, and little moments that most people would never notice. Chief always appeared first in every entry. Samuel described him as the quiet guardian who never ate until the younger horses had settled, the first to investigate strange sounds, and the last to seek shelter during storms because he refused to leave the others alone. Emily slowly looked up from the pages toward the pasture. Suddenly she no longer saw a cautious horse standing far away. She saw an old protector carrying responsibilities that no one else had recognized. She softly thanked Samuel for leaving behind lessons instead of instructions. Over the following days Emily began speaking to the horses while she worked, never expecting a response. She talked about repairing loose boards, changing the water, the changing weather, and sometimes even about how much she missed hearing Samuel's stories. Her voice became another familiar sound drifting across the ranch alongside the wind and the singing meadowlarks. Then one peaceful afternoon something unexpected happened. Emily placed several fresh apples beneath the oak tree before returning to her chair with another journal resting on her lap. She became so absorbed in reading that she almost missed the faint sound of careful footsteps moving through the grass. When she finally looked up, Chief had quietly crossed much of the distance between them. He remained about 20 feet away, standing perfectly still with his ears pointed forward and his calm eyes resting on Emily instead of the apples. Neither of them moved. Emily resisted every instinct to smile too broadly or stretch out her hand. She simply lowered her eyes for a moment and continued reading in a calm voice. After several long minutes Chief lowered his head, picked up one apple, and slowly walked back toward the waiting herd. None of the other horses approached, but every one of them had watched what their leader chose to do. Emily felt tears gathering in her eyes, not because she believed the hardest part was over, but because she finally understood that the first piece of Samuel's promise no longer belonged only to her. Chief had taken the first step toward keeping it with her. Summer settled firmly over central Texas, bringing long afternoons filled with warm sunlight, the scent of fresh hay, and the steady chorus of cicadas drifting across the pastures. Nearly 3 weeks had passed since Emily Carter first unlocked the ranch gate with Samuel Walker's old brass key, and although the distance between her and the horses had slowly grown smaller, she understood that the real journey had only begun. Chief now accepted apples from beneath the oak tree almost every afternoon, and on rare occasions he remained close enough for Emily to hear his slow breathing before quietly returning to the herd. The other horses still depended on his judgment. If Chief stayed calm, they stayed calm. If he moved away, every horse followed without hesitation. One particularly hot afternoon Emily continued sorting through Samuel's journals inside the old ranch house after finishing her chores. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard inside his bedroom she discovered a weathered wooden box that she had never noticed before. Inside were faded photographs, handwritten letters, veterinary records, and a folded map of the ranch with small notes written carefully in the margins. She carried everything onto the front porch where a gentle breeze offered relief from the heat and began reading through each page one by one. The photographs showed the horses years earlier when they were younger, healthier, and standing proudly beside Samuel during local ranch gatherings and community events. Children smiled while gently brushing their coats, neighbors gathered for seasonal cookouts, and every picture reflected a ranch that had once been filled with laughter. Emily found it difficult to believe she was looking at the very same horses that now watched people from a cautious distance. Then she unfolded one of Samuel's letters, written several years before his health began to decline. In careful handwriting he explained that every horse on the ranch had arrived after someone else had given up on it. Some had become too old to work. Others had been overlooked because they needed patience instead of quick results. Samuel wrote that he never considered them unwanted because every living creature deserved one place where it never had to earn the right to belong. Emily slowly lowered the letter and looked toward the pasture where the herd grazed quietly beneath the afternoon sun. At that moment she finally understood why Samuel had protected them with such determination. He had not built a business. He had built a refuge. As his illness gradually limited his strength, he continued caring for the horses every single day, but he no longer had enough energy to welcome visitors, organize community gatherings, or ask neighbors for help. The ranch slowly disappeared from everyone's routine, and without meaning to, the community drifted away while the horses remained together with the only person they completely trusted. They had never stopped believing in Samuel. They had simply lost every other familiar face. Emily folded the letter with great care before walking toward the pasture fence. Chief noticed her almost immediately and quietly lifted his head. This time he did not retreat. He simply watched as Emily rested both hands on the top rail and softly thanked Samuel for teaching her the truth even after he was gone. A gentle breeze carried her voice across the field, and one by one the horses gradually looked toward her instead of turning away. Chief remained perfectly still for several moments before taking another slow step forward. It was only a single step, but Emily realized it carried years of memory with it. She also realized something else that made her heart race. If these horses had learned to trust one person so completely before, perhaps they could learn to trust again. She only hoped the rest of the world would give them enough time to prove it. By the time August arrived, the ranch no longer felt like a place frozen in time. Every sunrise brought another small sign that life was quietly returning to the land Samuel Walker had loved for so many years. Emily Carter continued following the same routine without skipping a single day. She filled every water trough before the Texas heat settled over the fields, repaired broken fence rails one board at a time, brushed away weeds that had begun creeping around the barn, and read aloud from Samuel's journals beneath the old oak tree every afternoon. She never changed the rhythm because she understood that the horses had begun trusting the routine as much as they trusted her. Chief no longer stopped 20 feet away. Nearly every day he calmly walked to the oak tree while Emily sat reading, lowered his head to accept an apple from the grass beside her chair, and remained nearby for several quiet minutes before returning to the herd. The younger horses watched carefully from a distance at first, but curiosity slowly replaced caution. One chestnut mare stepped forward a few yards before stopping. A black gelding followed the next afternoon. Within another week, nearly half the herd felt comfortable grazing close enough for Emily to hear the peaceful sound of their breathing as warm summer breezes moved across the pasture. She never reached toward them unless they chose to come closer on their own. The change was gradual, almost impossible to notice from one day to the next, yet remarkable when compared with the fearful distance that had once separated them. Word of the quiet transformation slowly spread through the surrounding community. A neighboring ranch couple stopped by one Saturday morning after hearing that the horses appeared healthier than they had in months. They expected to find a struggling teenager overwhelmed by responsibility. Instead, they found clean stalls, repaired fencing, fresh hay stacked neatly inside the barn, and 11 horses whose coats had regained a healthy shine beneath the summer sun. The couple offered to donate several bales of coastal hay before leaving. 2 days later another neighbor arrived with lumber left over from a fencing project. By the end of the week a retired farrier volunteered to inspect every hoof without asking for payment. Emily thanked each person sincerely, realizing that kindness often spread quietly. From one person to another, just like trust. Even Chief seemed to notice the difference. Whenever familiar visitors entered the ranch beside Emily, he observed them carefully but no longer gathered the herd to retreat toward the far pasture. His confidence appeared to reassure the others that these people had come to help rather than disturb their peaceful home. One evening after the volunteers finished repairing an old section of fencing, everyone gathered beneath the oak tree to drink cold lemonade before heading home. As laughter drifted across the ranch for the first time in years, Chief slowly walked out of the pasture and stopped just beyond the fence line where everyone could see him clearly. The remaining horses quietly followed until the entire herd stood together beneath the fading golden light. No one moved. No one spoke above a whisper. It felt as though the horses were simply watching the ranch come alive again. Emily smiled as she remembered Samuel's words about every living creature deserving one place where it never had to earn the right to belong. Looking across the peaceful pasture, she realized that his dream was finally beginning to breathe again. Yet as hopeful as everything seemed, a certified letter tucked inside the old mailbox at the end of the gravel driveway waited to deliver news that would soon test every promise she had fought so hard to keep. The following morning Emily Carter carried the certified letter from the mailbox into the quiet ranch house, setting it carefully on Samuel Walker's old kitchen table before taking a slow breath. She had a feeling the envelope contained more than an ordinary notice, and the uneasy silence surrounding it confirmed her suspicion. As she unfolded the documents inside, her heart sank. The ranch was carrying unpaid property taxes, outstanding maintenance expenses, and several legal obligations that had accumulated during Samuel's final years of declining health. Unless the balance was resolved within 60 days, the property would enter a public sale process. The land, the barn, and everything attached to it, including the future of the horses, could soon belong to someone else. Emily quietly lowered the papers onto the table. She had expected challenges, but she had never imagined that time itself would become her greatest opponent. That afternoon she visited the county office hoping there might be another solution. The staff treated her with kindness and respect, explaining that no one questioned Samuel's character or the value of the ranch. Unfortunately, legal deadlines could not simply disappear because a story touched people's hearts. Emily thanked them for their honesty before driving back along the familiar country road with the folded notice resting on the passenger seat beside her. When she returned, Chief was already waiting near the gate. It had become his habit to notice the sound of her truck before any of the other horses. As Emily stepped from the cab, Chief slowly walked toward her until only a few feet separated them. For the first time, he did not stop. He gently lowered his head, and after a brief hesitation Emily carefully reached forward, allowing her hand to rest softly against the side of his neck. Chief remained perfectly still. His warm breath drifted across her shoulder as though he had quietly decided that she now belonged within his circle of trust. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, grateful for the simple comfort that no words could provide. Yet even as hope filled her heart, the weight of the letter remained impossible to ignore. Over the next several weeks Emily worked harder than ever before. She accepted extra shifts helping neighboring ranches repair fencing, cleaned horse trailers on weekends, and sold handmade leather crafts at the local farmers market whenever she found free time. Every dollar she earned went toward preserving the ranch, but the total still seemed painfully small compared with what was needed. Friends from the community continued donating hay, lumber, and supplies, reducing expenses wherever possible, yet the approaching deadline never stopped moving closer. One evening, after finishing another long day of work, Emily sat beneath the old oak tree with Samuel's journals resting across her lap. Chief quietly approached and stood beside her while the remaining horses grazed peacefully nearby. She looked across the pasture and whispered that she had not forgotten her promise, even if she no longer knew how to keep it. A gentle breeze carried her words through the tall grass. Just then, headlights slowly turned onto the gravel driveway leading toward the ranch. An unfamiliar pickup truck came to a stop beside the barn, and a woman stepped out carrying a folder marked with the logo of a regional equine preservation foundation. Emily had never seen her before, and she had no idea why she had come. As Chief calmly remained at Emily's side instead of retreating with the herd, the visitor smiled quietly, as though the very scene unfolding before her had already answered the first question she intended to ask. The woman introduced herself as Rebecca Morgan from the Texas Equine Preservation Foundation, explaining that she had heard about the old ranch through volunteers who had been quietly impressed by the remarkable change taking place there. She admitted that she had expected to find another abandoned property struggling to survive. Instead, she found 11 calm horses grazing peacefully, clean barns, repaired fences, and a young ranch girl standing beside the elderly herd leader as though they had spent years earning each other's trust. Rebecca asked if she could walk through the ranch before discussing anything further. Emily gladly agreed, never imagining that this ordinary tour might become the turning point Samuel Walker had hoped for. They spent the next 2 hours crossing the property together beneath the warm Texas sun. Emily spoke honestly about every challenge she faced. She explained that she still worked extra jobs to buy feed, that neighbors had donated supplies, and that every improvement had come through patience rather than money. She never exaggerated the story or asked for sympathy. She simply described the promise she had made and the responsibility she refused to abandon. Rebecca listened carefully without interrupting. As they approached the old oak tree, Chief slowly lifted his head and began walking toward them. Emily stopped where she was, allowing the elderly quarter horse to make his own decision. Rebecca quietly folded her arms. and watched. Chief crossed the final few yards without hesitation before gently resting his muzzle against Emily's shoulder. The remaining horses gradually followed behind him until the entire herd stood peacefully around them in a wide circle. No one had called them. No one carried feed buckets. They had simply chosen to be near the person they trusted most. Rebecca remained silent for several moments before quietly admitting that she had visited dozens of rescue ranches across Texas, but she had rarely witnessed trust that looked so natural. She asked Emily how long professional trainers had been working with the horses. Emily smiled softly and answered that there had never been any trainers. There had only been time, consistency, and the promise she refused to break. Before leaving that afternoon, Rebecca asked permission to photograph the ranch and record part of Emily's story for the Foundation's review committee. Emily agreed, believing that even if nothing came from it, perhaps more people would remember that older horses still deserved a chance. During the following 2 weeks the Foundation shared photographs and the story of the forgotten ranch through its community newsletter and social media pages. Messages of encouragement began arriving from across Texas. Families mailed small donations for feed. Local businesses offered fencing materials. A veterinarian volunteered seasonal wellness examinations. Even people who could not contribute financially sent handwritten letters thanking Emily for reminding them that compassion often began with simple daily choices. The greatest surprise arrived during a special Foundation meeting held at the ranch itself. Rebecca returned with several board members, community leaders, and longtime supporters who wanted to see the horses in person. As everyone gathered near the pasture, Chief once again walked directly toward Emily before calmly standing beside her. Without any signal, the remaining horses quietly followed until all 11 stood together behind their trusted leader. The peaceful scene spoke more clearly than any speech ever could. After a long moment Rebecca smiled and announced that the Foundation had unanimously approved an emergency preservation partnership. The remaining property debt would be resolved through a combination of grants, community donations, and historical preservation funding, allowing the ranch to remain a permanent sanctuary. Emily felt tears fill her eyes as relief finally replaced months of uncertainty. Looking across the pasture toward the horses Samuel had loved so deeply, she realized that the promise everyone believed impossible was no longer carried by one person alone. An entire community had chosen to carry it with her. Autumn arrived with cooler mornings and long ribbons of golden light stretching across the rolling pastures, giving the ranch a quiet beauty that Emily Carter had never seen before. The legal papers that once threatened everything Samuel Walker had built were finally resolved, and for the first time since making her promise, she woke without wondering whether the horses would lose their home. The partnership with the Texas Equine Preservation Foundation brought more than financial security. Volunteers arrived every weekend to repair aging barns, replace weathered gates, restore grazing areas, and repaint the old ranch house without changing the simple character Samuel had always loved. Emily insisted that every improvement honor his memory rather than erase it. The weathered oak tree remained untouched, the old wooden bench stayed beneath its familiar branches, and Samuel's journals were carefully displayed inside a small reading room where visitors could learn about every horse that had found safety on the ranch. Chief adapted to the changes with the same quiet confidence he had shown throughout the summer. Because he accepted the volunteers, the rest of the herd gradually welcomed them as well. Families who visited the ranch often stopped in amazement as the elderly brown quarter horse calmly approached Emily whenever she entered the pasture. Children quickly learned that trust could not be hurried. Emily encouraged them to sit quietly beneath the oak tree instead of chasing the horses, explaining that patience was the greatest gift they could offer any frightened animal. Week after week the horses became more relaxed around gentle visitors, yet they never lost the peaceful bond that had first begun through simple routines and quiet respect. One crisp Saturday morning Rebecca Morgan returned with several members of the Foundation to celebrate the ranch's official reopening as a permanent sanctuary for senior and overlooked horses. Neighbors gathered beneath strings of simple lights hung between the trees while homemade pies, fresh lemonade, and country music created the feeling of an old-fashioned community gathering that Samuel would have recognized immediately. Emily was invited to say a few words before the ribbon was cut, but instead of speaking about herself, she held one of Samuel's journals in her hands and thanked the old cowboy who had believed forgotten horses still deserved a future. She admitted that she had almost lost hope more than once, but every time she looked into Chief's patient eyes she remembered that promises were kept one ordinary day at a time. As the guests applauded, Chief quietly walked through the open pasture gate and stopped beside Emily without anyone calling him. The remaining horses followed at an easy pace until all 11 stood peacefully nearby beneath the wide Texas sky. Many visitors smiled through tears because the scene required no explanation. The horses were no longer waiting for someone to save them. They were already home. Later that evening, after the last truck disappeared down the gravel road and silence settled over the ranch once again, Emily carried a small lantern beneath the old oak tree. She opened Samuel's favorite journal to its final blank page and carefully wrote that the promise had been kept, that every horse remained safe, and that the ranch would continue welcoming those the world had overlooked. She gently closed the journal, looked across the moonlit pasture where Chief and the herd rested together in complete peace, and smiled softly. The promise that had begun beside a quiet bedroom window had finally become the future Samuel had always dreamed his horses would one day inherit. 5 years passed, and the quiet ranch that had once stood on the edge of being forgotten became a place where hope quietly found a home every single day. Travelers from across Texas and neighboring states followed the winding gravel road not because they expected a grand attraction, but because they had heard about a young ranch woman who had kept an impossible promise and about 11 horses that had taught an entire community the meaning of trust. Emily Carter had grown into the role she never expected to inherit. Every sunrise still began the same way it had on her very first morning. She filled the water troughs, walked the fence lines, greeted every horse by name, and carried a fresh apple beneath the old oak tree before sitting on the weathered bench with one of Samuel Walker's journals resting across her lap. The routines had never become old because they were no longer chores. They had become traditions. Chief had grown older, his steps slower and his muzzle touched with more gray than brown, yet he remained the quiet guardian of the pasture. Visitors often smiled when they noticed that he still appeared beside Emily without being called, gently lowering his head near her shoulder before the rest of the herd calmly gathered around them. Many people assumed they had been together forever, never realizing that their friendship had begun with weeks of silence, patience, and one careful step at a time. Children visited the ranch throughout the year to learn about horses that had once been overlooked because of age or circumstance. Emily always shared the same lesson before anyone entered the pasture. She reminded every visitor that kindness could never be rushed and that trust was never something another living creature owed them. Then she invited everyone to sit quietly beneath the oak tree and simply wait. More often than not, one curious horse would slowly approach, followed by another, until smiles replaced expectations. The ranch became known as a sanctuary not only for senior horses but also for people carrying heavy hearts. Veterans, foster families, retirees, and young volunteers discovered that peaceful mornings among the horses often brought a sense of calm they had been unable to find anywhere else. Emily believed that Samuel would have smiled if he could have seen how many lives his quiet dream continued to touch. Inside the restored ranch house, his journals remained carefully preserved behind glass, with one final handwritten page resting at the end. Visitors frequently paused to read Emily's simple message describing how the promise had been fulfilled and how every horse had found lasting safety. Yet those who spent time on the ranch soon realized that the true ending was not written inside the journal. It lived outside in every pasture, every repaired fence, every volunteer willing to lend a hand, and every horse peacefully grazing beneath the wide Texas sky. One calm autumn evening Emily stood beneath the familiar oak tree as the setting sun painted the fields with warm shades of gold. Chief slowly walked beside her and rested quietly at her side while the remaining horses grazed nearby. Looking across the land that had once seemed impossible to save, she softly thanked Samuel for trusting someone who had once doubted herself. A gentle breeze moved through the branches above, carrying the familiar sounds of content horses across the pasture. Emily smiled, knowing that promises built on compassion never truly ended. They simply became part of someone else's beginning, just as one old cowboy's final wish had become a lasting home where forgotten horses would never be forgotten again.